You're not tired because you've done too much. You're tired because you've felt too much that was never yours to carry. That's the truth no one says out loud. There is a kind of exhaustion that can't be cured with sleep, because it's not in your body. It's in your soul. The weight you carry isn't yours, but it lives in your nervous system anyway. She could feel it all. Every silence in a conversation, every unspoken frustration, every emotional shift in the room, like wind changing direction. This wasn't awareness. This was saturation. Some people walk through the world with armor. She walked through it like exposed skin. Every mood around her landed like a bruise, every sorrow, every subtle sigh, a weight. She carried it, not because she wanted to, but because it happened before she even had the words to choose otherwise. They called her a good listener. They called her calm. What they didn't see was the storm swelling behind her rib cage, a storm made of everyone else's grief, guilt, rage, regret, and her own voice barely a whisper beneath it all. She thought she was being strong. She thought this is what kindness was supposed to look like. But no one told her kindness without self-respect isn't noble. It's slow, invisible self-erasure. She became the safe place for others to land while forgetting how to stand for herself. And the more she did it, the more it became her identity. This is what they don't teach empaths, that you can be so good at tuning into others that you vanish inside their frequency. She didn't remember the exact moment she disappeared, but she felt the ache of absence, not of someone else, of herself. And maybe you felt it too. That strange heaviness at the end of the day when no one yelled, no one cried, and yet you feel completely emptied. Like your soul has been mined by every conversation. And still, you smile, you show up, you say you're fine, because the world praises resilience, even when it's a mask stretched over collapse. But resilience without release is just a ticking clock. So let's name it. This isn't balance, it's a burden. And the question she asked, the one that changed everything, wasn't about how to give less. It was this: what happens when you've taken on so much of the storm that the lightning starts to live in your chest? What happens when you are no longer the calm in the chaos, but the chaos in disguise? That's where the unraveling begins, not in weakness, but in the moment you realize you were never meant to carry what you've been holding. Collapse doesn't come with warning signs, it comes with stillness. A quiet crack that splits through your center so softly you almost miss it. She didn't break down in a crisis. She broke down in the kitchen, holding her phone after a friend vented for 45 minutes. She said all the right things, gave the right tone, held the space, then dropped the phone and slid to the floor like her bones had finally given up. It wasn't the words that broke her. It was the realization that she had spent years being everyone's lifeboat and forgot what it felt like to have her own shore. That's the thing about emotional overfunctioning. You become so good at being there for others that they forget you exist as a person with thresholds and blood and breaking points. And then, one day, you forget too. She looked in the mirror that night, and it was like looking at a watercolor that had been rained on. All the edges gone. Everything blurred, still beautiful but not whole. She didn't know where she ended and everyone else began. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sad about it. She was angry, not loud anger, not destructive. It was the kind of anger that burns clean, the anger that lives beneath decades of self-denial, saying, I deserve more than this. She remembered a story she once heard in a meditation class about Avalokitesvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. He vowed to free the world from suffering, but when he saw how much pain still remained, his body shattered. They say his head broke into pieces, his arms exploded from the weight, but the gods rebuilt him, not as he was, but as something more. With 1,000 arms to hold more wisely, 1,000 eyes to see with deeper clarity. He didn't become less through breaking, he became sovereign. That story hit her like lightning, because suddenly she knew this wasn't weakness, this was metamorphosis, the moment when the structure built to survive becomes too small for who you're meant to become. She wasn't failing. She was molting, so she made the decision that every healing story hides behind poetry. She stopped. She stopped explaining. She stopped absorbing. She stopped confusing emotional labor for connection. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew this: she would no longer disappear to make others feel whole. She would no longer sacrifice clarity for approval. And for the first time in her life, the silence around her felt less like punishment and more like permission. She wasn't lost. She was finally empty enough to be filled with something true. And that was the beginning. Silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it feels like suffocation. That's the part they never say. They tell you to take space, to rest, to go inward, as if solitude is always gentle. But when you've built your identity on absorbing the world around you, stepping back feels like vanishing. At first she thought the quiet would calm her, but the moment she pulled away from the noise, all the things she'd been holding rose up like ghosts. Old memories, tiny betrayals. Things she said yes to when her whole body was screaming, no. She didn't miss the people. She missed the version of herself she pretended to be when they were around. And that's when it started. Not healing, but the haunting. The silence didn't offer clarity. It offered confrontation, and she had to face it. She had confused emotional absorption with love. She had made herself a filter for the pain of others because she didn't believe she was allowed to feel her own. She walked alone now, not out of bitterness but necessity. Each step was unfamiliar, like relearning how to breathe without mirrors around. There's a story, ancient and aching, of the Selkie, a seal woman who comes to land whose sealskin is stolen by a man who wants to keep her. She becomes his wife, bears his child, but over time she begins to fade. Her eyes dim, her spirit hollows, until one day her child finds the hidden skin and she returns to the sea. Not because she didn't love the life she lived, but because she could no longer survive without returning to who she was. That story lived in her bones, because that's what silence was doing. It was handing her back her skin. She wasn't isolating, she was remembering that she was more than her usefulness, more than her empathy, more than her reflection in someone else's story. She started to ask different questions. Not how do I help them, but how do I hold myself? Not what do they need, but what do I feel? And at first the answers were jagged. They came in tears, in shaking hands, in the quiet ache of knowing she had spent years being the calm for others while her own soul screamed in silence. But she stayed with it, with the rawness, with the discomfort. And slowly the silence changed. It became less like absence and more like sanctuary, not because it stopped hurting, but because she stopped running from what it revealed. In that quiet, she began to touch something that didn't belong to anyone else. Not a reaction, not a performance, not a mirror. Herself, unfiltered, unapologetic, unimpressed by how well she could hold pain that wasn't hers. This wasn't detachment. This was reclamation, and it didn't feel like bliss. It felt like fire. Because to sit with yourself, truly sit, without distraction, without rescue, is to stand inside the emotional tempest and learn how to breathe anyway. She didn't retreat from the world. She stepped back to see it clearly, and for the first time she wasn't afraid of what she'd find when the noise stopped. Because she had begun to remember, beneath all the roles, beneath all the people-pleasing, beneath all the beautiful ways she vanished for others, there was a pulse, hers, and it was enough to follow. They say you find peace in the stillness. But what she found was fury, not the kind that burns others, the kind that burns illusions, the kind of fury that says no more. Not out loud, but in the marrow, the kind that rises not to destroy, but to redefine. She had spent so long swallowing the tension in rooms, quietly bracing herself for emotional storms that weren't hers. It was easy to forget that her body had needs too. Her heart had limits. Her spirit had a threshold. She used to mistake guilt for guidance. The moment she felt resistance, she assumed it meant she should give more. Now she knew that resistance was her wisdom, trying to protect what little was left. She didn't become cold, she became clear. And clarity is fire. It scorches the convenient lie that you owe your softness to anyone who demands it. It purifies the belief that you have to bleed to be seen as loving. She stopped explaining her boundaries, because she finally understood her peace is not a public debate. There's a story still humming in her memory. A teacher on a train in Tokyo, a drunk man raging, everyone bracing for the fight, until an old man speaks, not with fear, but with warmth, asks the drunk what kind of steak he prefers, tells him about the persimmon tree in his backyard. The drunk man sobs, crumbles, because what force couldn't shift, presence softened. That was the moment she understood. You don't need to fight everything that threatens your peace. You just need to embody what cannot be shaken. She stopped rushing into the fire to save people who kept lighting the match. She stopped letting guilt steer the ship. She let it burn the roles, the obligations, the belief that she needed to be everything for everyone. And in that burning, she forged something new, not armor, not defense, but embodiment. She didn't become harder, she became rooted, no longer the sponge, now the lighthouse, radiant, still, unbothered by the crashing of waves, because she knew the waves were never personal. They were just weather, and she had built something within herself that didn't move just because the wind changed. She didn't raise her voice anymore. She didn't over-explain. She simply stood in her knowing, and if someone couldn't meet her there, she didn't chase. Because the fire within her was no longer about proving, it was about presence. And presence, true grounded presence, is the fiercest clarity there is. She didn't rise in a blaze. She returned in fragments, not triumphant but true, not radiant but real. The world hadn't changed. The demands still knocked at her door. The noise still pressed against her silence, but something inside her had shifted. And this time, it didn't shift back. She no longer walked into rooms wondering what emotions she might catch. She walked in carrying her own, not as armor, but as a rooted presence that said without a word, I will feel, but I will not absorb. I will witness, but I will not abandon myself to save you. This is what reclaiming feels like. Not loud, not theatrical, just a quiet refusal to leak anymore. She didn't become distant, she became discerning. She didn't become cold, she became contained. She began to see her energy not as a resource for others to siphon, but as sacred ground. And sacred things are not made available to everyone. They are chosen, they are guarded. They are given only when the soul says yes. This is where her Soulskin returned. Not all at once, but slowly, breath by breath, boundary by boundary. It wasn't a costume she put on. It was a memory that rose from within. A deep knowing she had buried beneath a lifetime of self-sacrifice. And now that she had it again, she wasn't going to let it go. Not even for love. Especially not for love. Because love that requires you to bleed to be seen is not love. It's hunger. And she was no longer offering herself as the meal. She moved through her life differently now. Where once she said yes from fear, she said no from freedom. Where once she listened to soothe, she now listened to understand and to decide whether she wanted to stay. Not every pain was hers to tend, not every storm was hers to calm, and she had no interest in being admired for her ability to carry what others refused to heal in themselves. She was not the sponge anymore. She was the tide, moving not to please but to honor rhythm, her rhythm. Some called it selfish, she called it survival. Some called it cold, she called it returning. This wasn't a rejection of her empathy, it was its evolution. Because empathy without discernment is martyrdom, but empathy with self-respect, that's clarity, that's alchemy, that's how you rise without leaving yourself behind. The storm didn't stop. The world didn't get quieter, people didn't start asking less of her, but she was no longer waiting for the conditions to change before she allowed herself peace. Because now, the peace wasn't conditional, it wasn't external, it lived inside her like a center that couldn't be stolen. She had become the eye of the storm, still, rooted, undisturbed by what swirled around her, and it wasn't because she stopped feeling. It was because she stopped confusing absorption with compassion. Her boundaries weren't walls, they were filters. They let in what nourished, they deflected what drained. And the people who had once loved her for how easily she gave herself away, They noticed. Some left, some got louder, some called her distant, difficult, changed. But the ones who stayed, they met her in the stillness, not with demands, but with presence. She no longer filled the silence with solutions. She let silence speak. She let others sit in their discomfort without rushing to fix it, because she understood now, rescuing people from their own growth is not love, it's interference. She was no longer flattered by being needed. She was moved only by being seen. The candle from the beginning still burning, but it wasn't flickering in some distant window. It was burning in her center, brighter, calmer, unshakable. She didn't need the world to validate her new stillness, because peace is not applause, it's alignment, and she had found it. The storm still howled, but it no longer entered her, because she finally understood. The chaos around you is not your fault, but the calm within you is your responsibility. And that's the truth this story has been trying to tell you. You were never meant to carry what wasn't yours. You were never meant to disappear to be good. You were never meant to break just to prove you care. You were meant to feel, yes, deeply, fully, but you were also meant to stand, to breathe, to hold your own pulse like a prayer. And if you've been drowning in silence, this isn't your ending, it's your turning point, because the tempest will always rage. But now you know you were never meant to be the sponge, you were meant to be the center, the calm, the lighthouse, the tide that moves without apology. If this felt like your story, it is, and if someone came to mind while you listened, send it to them. Let them know they're not weak for feeling too much. Let them know they're not alone in learning to hold less. And if this video gave language to something you've lived without words, don't keep it to yourself, because silence is sacred, but some silences are meant to be broken. Let this be that moment, the one where the storm ends, not outside but inside, where it always mattered most.